Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel. Today we have a very special guest. We're excited to have with us Blair Neelands. Blair is the Sustainability and Outreach Coordinator for the Portland Timbers and Thorns, and she's going to talk to us about all the great work that they're doing in the Pacific Northwest there. And Blair, welcome to the show.
Hey, Roy, thanks for having me.
We're excited to learn more about what you're doing in Portland. But before we do that, I kind of want to back up a little bit and talk to you about your background and how you got interested in sports when you were young and what attracted you.
Yeah, I'd say my path here to working for the Timbers and Thorns is a little bit different than a lot of my colleagues and friends I've met over the course of my time working in sports. But I grew up on the central coast of California, kind of right in the middle where the fandom splits for the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants. So there's a huge rivalry in my family there. I fall south to the Dodgers. But growing up, I really started to get a huge passion for sports and really the stories that come from sports. I'd say from Vin Scully, listening to him call Dodger games and, all the stories he'd tell about various players from the Dodgers and from the opponents. And I really found myself kind of having a similar passion, and my family would always joke and laugh at me because we'd be watching some sort of sporting event and I'd say, oh, that guy's from this town or that athlete, some unique story about them. And then inevitably 30 seconds later, someone like John Madden would kind of say the same thing. And my family would just look over and laugh. And so I really started to get a passion for storytelling in sports, but I didn't really realize that was a career path other than like working for ESPN or something of that nature, which felt so out of reach. And so I started in high school working on my high school newspaper and wanted to get into journalism, but really wasn't quite ready to jump into college. And so in 2007, I had actually made contact with an Army recruiter and started talking to him about opportunities in the military. And I found out that there was a job called public affairs. And I ended up joining the US Army. I went to basic training 5 days after my high school graduation and became a public affairs specialist. I served 5 years in the US Army. Doing photography, journalism, public relations, anything of that nature, and spent 12 months of my time deployed to Afghanistan and really learned a lot about communications during my time there. And then when I got out, I finished my degree through the University of Maryland, University College, which is located near Washington, D.C. And I took a job working at an electric company doing communications. Spent a couple years there, but really found myself thinking again, I have this passion for sports. Why am I working at an electric company telling people how to save money on their electric bill? So I started looking around at sports jobs and then discovered that sports business management was a thing in college. I had really no idea, and that there were several pretty prestigious sports business management master's programs. And as I started to do some research, I found the DeVos Sport Business Management program at the University of Central Florida. And I really was attracted to the program initially because of just their pillars of being focused on using sport for good and community service and innovation and diversity. And then I stumbled upon a TED Talk by Dr. Richard Lapchick, who is the chair of the program, and just fell in love with the program and everything he had to say. So I took the GMAT, I wrote an essay, I applied, I ended up getting an interview, and Dr. Lapchick asked me in the interview if I had applied for any other program, and I told him that I hadn't, because this was where I wanted to be. And so thankfully I got accepted. Otherwise, didn't really have a backup plan. But ended up going to the University of Central Florida and had the opportunity to work directly for Dr. Lapchick, which was just an amazing experience. I gained so much knowledge from him, looking at sport through that lens of diversity and social justice. And then after graduation, I decided to move to Portland. I grew up on the West Coast and had spent the last 10 years on the East Coast, and just wanted to be in a city that had values equal to mine. And I got incredibly lucky and found the position that I'm currently in at the Portland Timbers. And here, my role is really split between two different areas, where I work on our volunteerism, and getting our staff and our athletes and our partners out in the community, working right alongside community members and nonprofits. And then the other half of my job is looking at our sustainability initiatives and how we can not only improve our environmental footprint when it comes to operations and that side of the business, but also how we can encourage others to take steps toward a greener lifestyle.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground there, and I know that I think all of us that became sports fans as kids, right? There was that element of storytelling. You right, you really came in one of two doors or both, right? It was the physical activity that attracted you, and just the raw exercise and adrenaline from playing, or it was that, as well as the fact that you were listening to the stories. And I think one thing that's interesting is how some of the storytelling, at least in the broadcast of games, has really dwindled because of the rise of all the different forms of media and graphics and everything else. Everything that's in a graphic that you see pop up on ESPN was something that Vince Scully had to tell you in his voice and in his pace and in his delivery within the context of the game. And so things carried a different kind of weight when you talked about, how many times the team had come back after the bottom of the seventh inning, or, what the percentages were. We didn't have all of the advanced stats and metrics that exist now, but as you said, the story of the hometowns and where people were from, and how they got to the big leagues in a baseball context. I think sometimes it's a little bit sad that you don't have that same degree of storytelling going on now. People are like, yeah, get to the game, give me the stats, and it's a different mentality. But I found it interesting when you talked about going into the Army and doing public affairs, because for most people, 5 days after high school graduation, right, they're just hanging out, enjoying the summer and getting ready for college. And they work really hard during school, but it's a different type of environment than jumping into basic training and then spending time in the intensive environment that you were going through to prepare for Afghanistan and everything else that you did. So I think that really gives you a unique perspective of what's gone on. And it's interesting to see how you talked about Dr. Labchik, because as you know, he was one of our keynote speakers at Sports Philanthropy World. His presentation is unbelievable. For those that haven't had a chance, I encourage you to go and look through our YouTube channel and on our site, and you can see what he talks about. It's amazing work that was way ahead of its time, because he's been doing this for over 20 years, and now it's becoming popular, and so now people are talking about it, but he was doing it way before it had that popularity. And just an incredible leader, and what he's created down there is really a special program. And now, as you said, you've got to the Timbers, you've got the two roles with the volunteerism and sustainability. So take us through a little bit of each of those, and then how do you allocate your time? How do you really figure out what the split is. I'm sure it's full time on both, right? It's 40 hours a week of each.
Absolutely. I mean, I think anybody who works in the sports industry can attest to, there is no splitting evenly. We're all going 50 different directions, but we're here because we love it, right? And so I was actually hired to be the volunteer engagement coordinator for specifically, we have a program called Stand Together Week. Stand Together is our name for our community outreach platform. Since we have both the Timbers and Thorns, it really represents both teams coming together, the fans of both teams coming together and serving our community. And Stand Together Week we had our 9th year of doing it in 2020. And it began as one of our marquee initiatives to get out and volunteer. There are a lot of organizations out there in sports and otherwise that have a volunteer day or a weekend or kind of come around a certain event, such as upcoming Martin Luther King Weekend of Service. But we wanted to go big. And so we dedicate 7 days to get out in our community. And I was hired to coordinate and manage everything that has to do with that. So my first year running that was in 2019. And in the course of 7 days, we had, 32 events serving 25 nonprofits, and we activated more than 1,000 volunteers. And that includes our athletes. Every single athlete gets involved in at least one event. The majority of our staff, everyone gets involved. Our staff serves as volunteer leaders. So they get out in the community. It's a unique opportunity for some of our non-fan facing roles to interact with the fans and community and our athletes. And then we also get our partners involved, and then the fans can join us. And so it's a really unique opportunity for, you have a fan working on, say, a Habitat for Humanity house right next to Christine Sinclair, who's the all-time leading goal scorer in international football. And that's incredibly unique. And our fans jump at that opportunity to not only meet our players, but to work alongside them for greater good. So Stand Together Week is such an incredibly amazing program that we have, and I'm super honored to be involved in it and to put it on every year. But sustainability was really my personal passion. I started to learn about what sustainability in sports meant when I was in grad school. I entered grad school probably saying that I wanted to work in PR, given my background. It was a natural fit. But over the course of those 18 months at the DeVos program, I really was exploring the ways that sport can make an impact on our community. And through our mentorship program, I was introduced to Eileen McManaman from 5T Sports, who I know was on your podcast last year. She is amazing, and she invited me to come to the Green Sports Alliance conference, and that just completely opened my eyes to opportunities within sport. And so when I started here at the Timbers and Thorns, I saw that the environment was one of our pillars within our community program and for the organization. Our ownership has a big emphasis on sustainability, but we didn't have a person kind of dedicated to improving us and tracking where we were and where we were headed. And so I simply asked if I could take this on, and because our leadership is so amazing and trusting, they let me run with it. So I've really started this past year and a half or so, about half of my time, depending on the week, focused on figuring out what our baseline metrics are of what is our environmental footprint. And then once figuring that out, trying to find unique opportunities for us to improve that impact through partnerships, through fan engagement. And it's become such a great opportunity for us to come up with unique and innovative ways of interacting with partners and fans, as well as doing good.
What's really interesting, you talk about those as separate areas, right? But in many ways, there's a huge amount of overlap between the sustainability and the volunteerism and getting people involved. I think one of the areas, right, historically, sports has been perceived as sort of a black hole of creating waste, right? If you think about the amount of water bottles and cans of beer and containers of soda and everything else that come out of a sporting event, right? And just all waste. And you think about how big these venues are that get, right, in the scheme of things, very little use in terms of number of days a year compared to, say, an office building, right, where people pre-COVID, right, were working in there 5 days a week. And yet it brings people together in a way. So you get this volunteerism through Stand Together Week. You talked about 7 days, 32 events, 25 nonprofits, 1,000 volunteers. That's an enormous undertaking to manage that. So tell us when that typically occurs in the year and how far in advance you start planning.
Typically, we would have it in June. At least that's what I'm told, because the last 3 years we haven't had it in June. But typically it would be scheduled during a FIFA break, given that we have both teams and many of the players on both teams are national team players. It's really difficult to find a spot in the schedule where it fits. So normally we would have it in June because that also fits with a lot of nonprofits locally. We have a lot of, after school programs still happening or transitioning to summer programming. A lot of our environmental focused groups are doing, any sort of like tree care maintenance or invasive species type volunteer events. But the last 2 years, they've actually been in July, August timeframe, just because of many factors, especially for 2020, just kind of threw us all for a loop. But the last 2 years, it has been later in the summer because of the World Cup and the Olympics schedule kind of throwing us off as well. But I really start planning about 4 months in advance. We reach out to the nonprofits and just say, hey, this is the week we're looking at. And ultimately, Stand Together Week, the purpose is to serve these nonprofits. And so we don't cherry pick and say, we want to do this event because it looks better in photos or it's, better for our athletes or any other thing. We are reaching out and saying, this is the time we want to do it. So what do you need done? If it's a school looking for just some beautification and we're going to be picking up trash or painting a wall that needs to be painted, that's what we want to do. So that's where we start. We reach out to them and say, what do you need done? And then once we get all of those sort of applications back, I filter through all of the information and start putting it on a calendar and just trying to see what fits where. Depending on the year, we try to not do more than, like maybe 4 or 5 events in a day. And so it's a little bit of a Tetris trying to fit events into those 7 days to see where we can go, as well as our staff having to cover it. So that's kind of the next phase is I build that puzzle. And then after that's all confirmed, we start building out. I use a volunteer platform to put all of the information in where a volunteer would click, I want to do that habitat event with Christine Sinclair. I want to register, and it has all of the information listed out, all the safety information, the waivers, everything. It takes quite a bit of time to build that for 32 events. And then as we get to about a month and a half out, that's when we open it up to the public to say, this is where we're going to be and join us. This is how many spots are open. These are the age groups that can come. And on the other side, we're also working with our athletes and our partners to align them with where they want to go, what events are important to them. Because again, our athletes aren't going for a handshake and a photo. They're going to actually volunteer. And so we work with them to figure out what events they're passionate about. And we have a handful of athletes that challenge themselves every year to do at least one volunteer event a day. And so it's a lot of fun, but again, another little mini puzzle trying to figure out who fits where.
Well, those logistical requirements of putting together events, I think, are something people underestimate if they've never run events. They show up and everything looks easy. So
Yeah.
you think about it starting at the highest level, right? The game itself is a big event production. And yet a typical fan, right, will show up, we've got a ticket, you walk in and you take for granted all of the steps that are involved in getting you that ticket in the first place, but then scanning it and all the systems that go into making sure that that ticket hadn't been used by somebody else and managing it and all the food and beverage and the security and everything that goes into it. It's a huge undertaking. And then even running what we'll call smaller scale events like you're talking about with the volunteers, or whether it's a golf outing to raise money for an organization, there's just a lot of moving parts people take for granted. So you talked about that Tetris puzzle of piecing it together. That's really true. And I loved what you said about the athletes, because one of my complaints has always been that I think athletes are conditioned, unfortunately, to believe that they're really good for about four things when they're not competing. And that's signing autographs, taking photos, playing in golf outings, and showing up at fundraising dinners. And that's a gross disservice to their abilities and their interests, because they really do want to give back. But they have to have a way to be supported and channeled to do that. So something like this week is amazing, because you've got that process set up for them. They don't have to necessarily figure it out, but they learn a lot about what these organizations consist of. And I think, right, in an ideal world, they're going to then identify through the course of that week, hey, these are 2 or 3 organizations I would really like to be involved with on an ongoing basis. It's not just about showing up for one day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my goal of this week every year for both our athletes and our supporters and our staff and our partners. For anybody who gets to volunteer, I hope that through this process, they learn about a new organization that they would like to spend more time with. Because ultimately, that's a win in my book, is if some of these volunteers end up going back to these nonprofits, because so many of these organizations rely on steady, consistent volunteers who are passionate about their organization. And if we can use our platform to assist with that in any way, that's, like I said, a win in my book.
Yeah, it's terrific that you're incorporating the athletes, because I know that it's very challenging to get their schedules lined up when they have those breaks. And for the athlete, that's their downtime, right, where they can take a little bit of opportunity away from everything. So is that something that's built sort of not maybe directly into their contracts, but into the culture of the organization, where they know that this is something that's coming up in the given year?
It absolutely is. Stand together for our athletes and our staff. Kind of when you're first introduced to the organization, it's one of the first things that's talked about. And I know that I have a few colleagues that, as they've left our organization to take on a new opportunity, they come to our team and say, this was one of the best things about working here, is stand together. And I don't just say that to pat myself on the back. It's something that from the top is an initiative that everybody's kind of expected to join in. But it's built into that culture that it's something that we are about, and it's expected, and our community expects it. In 2020, when everything was being canceled, we still found a way to host Stand Together Week. It looked a little different. We had more virtual opportunities and more sort of individual opportunities where people didn't have to come in contact. And then our in-person events were very small, socially distanced events, but we had a handful of supporters that have been at every single Stand Together Week. And a couple of them told us, we were so happy to see that this was not canceled because everything else in our life has been canceled this year. And Stand Together Week was the one consistent thing that I was able to look forward to this year. And so it's really built into the culture of the entire club that everyone has bought into and is passionate about.
And that's such an important message coming from the top. You see the organizations that are really successful. And as you said, it's baked into the culture. It's just part of the expectation. I know when I was an NFL agent, there were some teams that, as part of their riders and the players' contracts, required them to participate in a certain number of events and certain types of events. And it's really a different element than somebody having to go and chase after those players on sort of an individual, one-on-one type of basis. But as you look ahead, actually, I want to take a look back first from the time that you've arrived at the Timbers and Thorn. What do you think have been the biggest challenges that you've seen to kind of growing this week of activism and everything that you're doing, and some of the challenges you saw when you arrived, and how those got sorted out over the course of your tenure?
So COVID restrictions aside, and not looking at the struggles of last year, I will say when I was hired, it was really, we were bringing this position in-house. It used to be organized by Hands-On Greater Portland, which is basically a subsidiary of the United Way. And so they're really the experts in volunteer outreach. They do amazing work in our community, and this is what they do. They constantly put on volunteer events. So it was a huge lift bringing it in-house. But ultimately, one of the reasons that they decided to bring this position in-house was just that continuity between our organization and the local nonprofits here that serve our community, because it was the way it was previously handled wasn't a negative. It was just that we didn't have those relationships with those nonprofits. It was kind of just hands-on, schedules it for us. And so our staff isn't having as much of a direct, what are your needs? What is this nonprofit about? What are we going to be exactly doing? Those conversations were being had at a different level. And so for me, coming in and starting new, the biggest challenge was building those relationships. Hands-On has been in our community for a long time, and those relationships had been built. And I had moved here 2 months prior to having these conversations. So I'm a newbie still trying to figure out my way, driving around Portland to meet with some of these nonprofits. And so that was the biggest challenge, was just establishing, those relationships and building on them. And now that it has been 2 years, it's been amazing to see some of the things that we've been able to do because of those relationships. Because instead of an organization having to go through a third party to ask, hey, Timbers and Thorns, can you come do this event? They can contact me directly and say, we have this event and we'd love to have you be a part of it. Or I'm even able to say, hey, do you have anything coming up? We'd love to work with you on a new program. So it was a little bit of a struggle building that in the beginning, but just like with any sort of networking or relationship building, you just have to work at it, and then eventually it becomes Somewhat simple. And we're now at a point where I think several of the organizations that we work with on a regular basis for Stand Together Week know, hey, this is Blair. She works at the Timbers and Thorns, and this is what they're about. So ultimately, I think it's all been working out for the better.
Yeah, it's an enormous undertaking, as you described, bringing it in house and having that continuity. And I think one of the things that's really challenging is how do you maintain that continuity and keep in touch with all of those volunteers during the course of the year. So what kinds of systems as an organization do you use, and how frequently are you in touch with the volunteers outside of the immediate rush to prepare for the week and the post event type of thank you, but outside of that 2 or 3 month window, how do you communicate with them the rest of the year?
We use a system that's open to the public and not super technically savvy, that we use to find volunteers and to get volunteer sign up. And it's worked out well. It's taken me a little bit to figure out some of the nuances, but for the price, it's worked out really well. And as far as communicating, we do communicate with volunteers post-event through our Stand Together newsletter. But with the current system, we don't have kind of a way to continually communicate. And that's something that I'd like to build on now that we are the ones directly communicating with volunteers. I'd like to grow that to, we have events throughout the year that have volunteers that go to them, but it's not us actively setting them up. But I'd love to get it to that point where, we have Stand Together Week, but can we continue to grow this and do a couple days throughout the year where we get volunteers to join us, so we continue to have that relationship with our community members. We just aren't really at that point yet with both technology and manpower in order to grow in that way.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time and effort to manage those systems, and as you said, to recruit and be able to track the volunteers and go back and pull up the records of this is where Blair's volunteered 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year. What can we do to keep her engaged and give her a different experience?
Right. It's currently an Excel spreadsheet on my desktop, but I know that there are systems out there that are far more advanced, and it's really a matter of integrating with. I've had conversations with our data analytics team on how to even integrate with what they're working with, but it's just a matter of putting in that effort to get us there. But that is kind of our ultimate goal, is to have that process in place.
Yeah, it is challenging to manage all of that data, and we end up getting data from so many different directions, and being able to use it effectively. We see that internally, and we hear that from almost every organization in terms of challenges on figuring out which CRM to use and which donor management system to use and which email marketing system to use. And right, you've got people coming in a lot of different doors. So that's a challenging aspect, no doubt. So I want to shift now a little bit to the sustainability side of things. I know that you said that's one of your personal passions, and the area that you're in geographically is well known as being an area with a probably, we'll say, a higher than average in the rest of the country in terms of that being a significant element of interest. So was that something that you saw going into your current position, that was going to be an opportunity for you to really take that lead and run with it?
Absolutely. In moving to Portland, that was a little bit of the idea. Was ultimately I wanted to work in sustainability in sports. I wanted to use sport to improve our environment. I didn't exactly know how There were a handful of positions at the team level across all the big leagues, but I didn't exactly know where I was going to fit. But I figured if I was going to find a fit, I might as well go where it's an interest of the fans and of the community. So it worked out. I definitely took a leap of faith on that one. And I will say I had also been somewhat convinced by a friend of mine, Kiyoki, who used to be the sustainability manager at the Trailblazers. And he may have convinced me a little bit about, how the environment was here, specifically in Portland, and how it was accepted. And the Trailblazers have been a leader in that space. And so in moving to Portland, it was really just all of those elements in one. And I had no idea where it was going to lead me.
Yeah, it's challenging, as you look ahead, right? That can be an overwhelming issue, and that can consume everything that you're doing. Um, the sustainability issues continue to be a big concern right around, not only around the country, but around the globe, in terms of where we're progressing. So give us some insight into what you see here as you look ahead over the next 3 years into some of the initiatives that the organization is taking to move ahead in that space.
So you already mentioned earlier, sports by default, it results in a lot of waste created, also results in a lot of emissions, because if we didn't exist as an organization or as a sport, all of these thousands of people, 25,000 people travel in some capacity to our stadium 30 plus times a year. And if we didn't exist, like in 2020, those emissions don't exist. So there are several factors that go into all of the different scopes in which we impact an environmental footprint. For us specifically, there are a handful of initiatives that we are kind of looking at to implement over the next couple years. There's a lot of talk in the industry about recyclable and compostable food and beverage products. One of them being the recyclable cup, the aluminum cup, and where that's headed. That definitely seems to be a product of interest for a lot of people across sports. And we have a specific issue when it comes to composting in our state that's a little bit odd that we have to kind of figure out. We have everything we give out is compostable, but currently it can't be composted because of some regulations in the state. So that's a major focus area for us, is figuring out, do we switch from compostable products? Do we work on changing the landscape of compost in the state of Oregon and in Portland? There's a lot up in the air, and some of those conversations have been halted due to COVID. But I'm looking at our waste stream, and it doesn't sound very appealing to a lot of folks to think about so much trash in that way. But that's a major focus for us. And then when it comes to the transportation piece, we're incredibly unique. We don't have parking downtown. Our stadium is right in the heart of downtown, but we don't have any parking. So we do have a large percentage of our fans do not take a passenger vehicle to the stadium. I believe in 2019, it was roughly 60% of our fans do not drive their own vehicle. They take the bus, they take the metro, they ride scooters. We have Nike Bike Town bikes all over the city. It's, as you mentioned, that's a major focus of people who live here. But how do we touch those other 40 to 50% of folks who do drive? What are ways we can encourage them to take these alternative modes of transportation? and how do we think creatively in partnership with the city to encourage people to take what's available. So that's a major focus. And then really the engagement piece with fans on some unique opportunities. I think there are some incredibly great examples of how people have encouraged their fans to take some small sustainability actions. And that's where I think we're headed next is we can make operational changes on our end, but how do we impact the 25,000 people that are in our stands those 30 plus times a year in order to make incremental changes without sounding preachy, without coming across as if we are judging or not rightfully telling people to take action if we aren't taking action. That's a huge element of it. And so I think that's where getting creative with communication, getting creative with our branding and our opportunities in order to engage fans. So I'd say those are our three focus areas.
Well, yeah, you raise a lot of interesting topics. One that really hit me was the issue of the lack of ability to compost the materials that you've specifically designed to be compostable. I don't know if you're allowed to export those out to another state to do the composting or not, but um, it's amazing that uh, when you look at the challenges, and we all understand why there's restrictions and regulations to control things, but um, I think it's hard. You talk about the aluminum cup and having something that's reusable sounds great, but what percentage of those 25,000 people are going to take those home and clean them and bring them back? And uh, at least for the next coming season, right? The concerns of how do you deal with things that are in the COVID issues of somebody reusing uh, a cup that you don't have any ability to determine, if it was cleaned properly, and whether, you want your workers handling that or somebody else handling that. There's all of those different issues as well. And so uh, it's going to be a hard thing, but I think that people have gotten better, right, at using recyclable, or I'll call it reusable water bottles, right? The rigid plastic or the aluminum, whether it's for coffee or for water bottles at the gym or anything else, instead of continually buying disposable plastic water bottles.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll continue to see improvement there, but certainly in the scale of crowds, as you said, 30 games times 25,000 people, um, that's a lot of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's, you know, 750,000 people a year coming through the venue, and that's without counting staff and vendors and every media and everything else that goes along with it. So I know it's an enormous undertaking. Blair, I want to thank you so much for coming on with us, but why don't you tell everybody how to reach you, and if they've got questions or ways that they can help you, what's the best way for them to touch base?
Yeah, the best way would be my email. My email is bneelands, which is NEELANDS @timbers.com. If you can find me on the website as well, or my LinkedIn, Blair Neelands. Yeah, I'd love to chat. I'm always passionate to chat about any sort of volunteering or sustainability topics. So hit me up anytime.
So before we let you go, I do want to put you on the spot for a minute here, and we're going to use our sports philanthropy superpowers and wave our magic wand, and we're going to make Blair now the commissioner of a sport. So tell us what sport you would choose.
I have to go with baseball, just because I'm a huge baseball fan, uh, and so I'd have to go there.
Okay, so
Being the
now
commissioner of
now
baseball
you're
is
now
amazing.
you're going to be commissioner of baseball, and You're moving Rob out of his office and taking charge there, and he's going to go retire. So you've got control now. What's your first line of attack, first change that you want to make? You move in and you got control right away, and you get to make up for all of the problems that you've seen over the years.
Oof. This is a huge question. And of course, my brain goes to, what can we do with sustainability initiatives? What could we do with equality? But the Dodger fan that I am, I cannot address anything without touching on the Houston Astros. And, I got to take that championship away just for redemption. Maybe that's a little selfish of me. But philanthropy wise, I'd have to go with some sort of, making sustainability, rise it up. I think a lot of people have been talking about it at some level for a long time. I know there are several people that I've met who've been at this for a very long time, but I think it needs to be raised up in the conversation and be a larger initiative beyond just some of those operational things that I've talked about. And really, I'd love to see Major League Baseball, as well as others, take a true leadership role when it comes to environmentalism and environmental policy. So that's what I would do first and second.
Well, so I think the Astros one you could accomplish very quickly. The sustainability is going to be a bigger project, trying to get all the teams together, but certainly worth the fight and worth the effort to make that occur. Blair, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Roy. I appreciate it.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, we appreciate you taking the time to join the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. This is your host, Roy Kessel, signing off. Don't forget to live generously.